What happens when you're a good admiral, but your entire crew is made up of peasants who had never seen the ocean before? Today, we're covering the Battle of Tsushima and what is probably the most embarrassing defeat in military history. It's the 18th century and European colonialism is at its peak. The Americas, the Pacific, and now even Africa were all being swallowed up in a great land grab by the European empires of the time. The native populations throughout the world could do little to resist the invaders armed with modern weaponry, and conquering and subjugating foreign lands went from daring adventures to the expectation and the norm. While the rest of Europe were busy sailing around the world, establishing colonies in exotic places, the Russian Empire instead headed east. The descendants of Genghis Khan, who once dominated the steppe, could do little to fight back against the might of the modern Russian army. And eventually, by the end of the 19th century, when he was crowned emperor, Nicholas II found himself the ruler of the largest contiguous land empire since the Mongols. Now Nicholas, like everyone else in Europe at the time, was fully bought into the idea of European domination of the world. It wasn't the weapons or strategy. It was just that Europeans were better at, well, everything. But while all of this was going on, a tiny island nation called Japan had overthrown their samurai shogun government and placed an emperor back on the throne. In just 20 years, the land of the rising sun had rapidly modernized into the first true industrial power in Asia. And as they watched Europe claim lands across the world, they began to think, that does seem pretty suga. So in 1894, Japan goes to war with China. With their modern military, they curb-stomp the Qing dynasty so badly that they're forced to surrender within a year. Amongst their territorial gains, the Japanese claim the warm water port known as Port Arthur on the Liaodong Peninsula. And when Tsar Nicholas finds out about it, he's not super happy. "Hey, I was just about to take that." My son, Nicholas' son, "I'm sure you can find another port." "I wanted this one. Guys, the Japanese took the port I was going to take. But we were the ones who beat the Chinese mine." Germany and France both had their own ulterior motives in getting Russia to expand into Asia. But once they got involved in the dispute, the Japanese were forced to give Port Arthur back to the Chinese. But the Russians soon took it for themselves, which was kind of a dick move and made the Japanese pretty upset. Japan still desperately wanted the respect of Europe and really wanted to be a part of what it saw as the cool kids colonizer club. And so they signed a mutual defense pact with the UK. And in 1899, they joined the Eight-Nation Alliance in the Boxer Rebellion, sending more troops than any nation to beat down the Chinese again. The Boxers were defeated, and Japan expected the Europeans to finally recognize them as an equal in the East. But Tsar Nicholas had other ideas. He leaves 100,000 of his troops in Manchuria, a sign of his colonial ambitions in the Far East. Not cool. That was the land the Japanese wanted to take. So, Emperor Meiji sends diplomats to St. Petersburg to try to de-escalate tensions and work things out. But Nicholas considers Japan a nation of, and he actually said this, yellow monkeys. And so, he doesn't even bother showing up to the meeting. At this point, the Japanese feel they have no other options. If Russia was trying to take Manchuria, what would be next? China? Korea? No, that would be unacceptable. If Russia thinks they can just walk in and colonize Asia, then maybe it's time for them to experience a little colonizing of their own. In the dark of the night on February 8, 1904, the Imperial Japanese Navy under the command of Admiral Hihikiro Togo launches a surprise attack on Russian forces in Port Arthur. The battle continues into the next day, and though neither side manages to sink any ships, the brazen attack by a small Asian nation against a European giant shocks the Russians. The formal declaration of war reaches St. Petersburg on April 10th, officially starting the Russo-Japanese War. The Japanese use ports in Korea to land their army for invasion, and Togo's fleet continues to keep the Russian Pacific Fleet divided between Port Arthur and Vladivostok. The Imperial Japanese Army is swift and engages the Russians at the Battle of Yalu River. The Russians are shocked by the ferocity of the Japanese soldiers, and they're pushed back deeper into Manchuria. The JA press on towards Port Arthur, and sensing that things are getting bad, the Tsar sends his best admiral, Stepan Makarov, to lead the Pacific Fleet. Makarov is a charismatic leader, and he quickly takes action with aggressive moves against the enemy. His confidence inspires his men. And finally, the Russians have someone who can stand up and go toe-to-toe with the Japanese. The Japanese continue towards Port Arthur, landing more troops just 20 miles away in Dalian. As the pressure continued to mount, the Russian Pacific Fleet makes another attempt to break the blockade. But Togo pushes them back, and the admiral who had replaced Makarov dies in the engagement. With no one left to lead them, the remnants of the Russian Navy is forced to return to port and do their best to weather the siege from the Imperial Japanese Army. Taking Port Arthur was something very familiar to the Japanese. In the Sino-Japanese War, it took them just one day. But this time, the Russians, unlike the Chinese, had modern weapons like machine guns, and the siege quickly turned into a meat grinder. The Russians fought like their lives depended on it, because honestly, they kind of did. And in response, Japanese generals began sending their troops charging straight into defensive machine gun fire. The results were horrific as wave after wave of Japanese soldiers were sent out, only to be cut down by the onslaught of bullets. By the end of it, the Japanese lost nearly 100,000 men. But in January 1905, they finally overwhelmed the exhausted defenders and took the port. The final remains of the Russian Pacific Fleet were then sunk in the harbor. Elsewhere, the Japanese army had pushed the Russians back to the city of Mukden. From February 20th to March 10th of 1905, 270,000 Japanese soldiers fought nearly 300,000 Russians in a battle that would remain the largest land battle in history. Until World War I, the speed of carnage was bone-chilling to all present. Never had so many humans died so quickly, and casualties soared over 160,000 men. The Japanese emerged the victors, but at a heavy cost. They were too tired, and their supplies too depleted to decisively end the war. The Russians, though badly beaten, would be able to send more reinforcements through the Trans-Siberian Railway. The Japanese knew they needed a knockout blow, and that responsibility would fall on the shoulders of Admiral Togo. He would not have to wait long for his opportunity. In October of the previous year, under the command of Admiral Zinovy Rozhestvensky, the Russian Baltic Fleet, now renamed the Second Pacific Fleet, was ordered to leave Europe and sailed to Asia to assist in the war. Rozhestvensky was a capable commander, probably the best choice Russia had under these circumstances. But there was just one problem. His crew was almost entirely made up of conscripted peasants who had never seen the water before, let alone fought on the open seas. It would be on him to not only lead this completely inexperienced crew on a voyage of 18,000 miles, but also to victory against a man who would go down in history as one of the greatest admirals of all time. Dramatization scene. Rozhestvensky. All right, men. It's time for all of you to show Japan what Russia is made of. Sailor 1. Yeah, what's a Japan? Sailor 2. I don't know, set sail. Music. Rozhestvensky. I told you idiots. The boats go in the water, not on the land. Sailor 3. Sir, the Kamchatka is reporting. They're seeing Japanese torpedo boats. We're all going to die. Rozhestvensky. We haven't left the Baltic Sea yet. You Japanese torpedo boats. Sailor 4. Japanese battleships. Why are they shooting at us? We're going down, everybody panic. Rozhestvensky. Stop, you idiots. Officer. Sir, we've lost the Kamchatka. Kamchatka radio. Hey, we're back. Fought a bunch of Japanese ships out there. Barely made it out of there alive. Officer. Sir, message from the Kamchatka again. It reads, have you seen torpedo boats? We're all going to die. Rozhestvensky. There are no torpedo boats. Sir, we've arrived in Madagascar. Rozhestvensky. Thank God. Now the idiots can't cause any more chaos. Sailor 5. This is my new pet Stephen. Stephen, no. Sailor 6. Check out these magic cigarettes I bought. Rozhestvensky. What is going on here? Show me those cigarettes. Oh my God. Okay, this is target practice. Shoot the target ship there. Be sure not to shoot the one towing it. I said don't shoot that one. Sailor yelling. Farewell, comrade. Rozhestvensky, who fired live rounds. Officer, the Kamchatka, sir. Message from the Kamchatka. They say they're sinking. "Oh, wait, they say they're fine now." Sailor, "A man, that's lame." Officer, "Sir, we're approaching Japan." Rajastvenski, "My God, we actually made it." The voyage from the Baltic Sea to Japan took 8 months, and against all odds, Rajastvenski had arrived with all his ships intact. Exhausted from the journey, he planned a beeline right to Vladivostok through the Strait of Tsushima. And this is exactly what Togo was waiting for. In the early morning hours of May 27, 1905, the Baltic Fleet makes its way towards the Tsushima Strait. The hospital ship Aral sees what it thinks to be a friendly Russian boat and begins signaling to it that the Baltic Fleet has arrived. After all the false alarms throughout their 18,000-mile voyage, the Russians had finally encountered a real Japanese ship, and they didn't even know it. Admiral Togo was immediately notified that the Russian reinforcements had arrived, and he quickly sends a message to Tokyo to inform the emperor of what was to come. He boards his flagship, the Mikasa, and the Imperial Japanese Navy sets out to confront the last hope Russia has in this war. At 1340, both fleets see each other, and everyone begins preparations for the battle to come. At 1355, Togo signals a message to his entire fleet. "The Empire's fate depends on the results of this battle. Let every man do his utmost duty." The Russians are first to open fire and target the Mikasa. Against all odds, Rajastvenski's crew of peasants score hits on the Japanese flagship, and she is rocked. Togo turns his fleet parallel to the Russian ships, and they begin returning fire broadside to broadside. Shells explode on and around both fleets, but it quickly becomes apparent how much better the newer British-made Japanese ships and weaponry are. The Russian ships are literally blasted to pieces. And despite their best efforts, most of their ships are smoking and on fire within 30 minutes. The Oslabya is the first casualty of the battle. It had taken too many hits and becomes the first modern battleship to be sunk by gunfire alone. Seeing the chaos spread throughout the Russian fleet, Togo issues the command that will turn him from an unknown Japanese admiral to a legend. As Rajastvenski pushes his ships forward, Togo orders his ships to perform a maneuver called crossing the T. They steam forward in front of the Russian line and block their escape. Every cannon in the Japanese Navy now has a clear shot at the Russian ships leading the line, and they do not miss a beat. Togo commands his men to open fire, and it is a massacre. Rajastvenski's flagship is hit, and he is seriously injured. Command of the Russian fleet is transferred to the Alexander III, but she is also hit. For the rest of the afternoon, the Russian fleet attempts to flee in any direction they can with Togo and his disciplined navy following their every move. By sunset, 4 Russian battleships have sunk, and the remains of the fleet are separated into small packs, all desperately trying to reach Vladivostok. As darkness engulfs the sea, Togo sends out his torpedo boats, and they hunt down the remnants of the Baltic fleet like predators in the night. By the next morning, the surviving Russians find themselves surrounded by Togo. They wave the international surrender flag, but the Japanese admiral did not have a code book with him that could decode the flag and instead opens fire once again. The Russians scramble to find a white tablecloth and desperately begin to fly it to signal their surrender as they're hit with more shells. Finally, a Japanese sailor finds a code book and identifies the original surrender flag being flown. The Russians, in desperation, take their own flag down and raise the Japanese flag instead, and Togo finally ceases fire and accepts the surrender of the Russian fleet. The outcome of the Battle of Tsushima rocked the world. This was the first time an Asian nation had ever defeated a European superpower in modern times, and the victory was not close at all. Only 3 Russian ships made it to Vladivostok, the rest destroyed or captured by the Imperial Japanese Navy. The Japanese lost just 3 torpedo boats in the battle. The morning of the 28th brings another surprise. A Japanese destroyer radios to Togo that they had found and captured Admiral Rajastvenski alive. The Japanese are in disbelief and cannot believe the admiral did not go down with his ship, but his identity is confirmed and he is brought to a hospital to treat his wounds. Sometime in the following days, Admiral Togo, dressed in plain clothes, pays a visit to his opponent. He sits at Rajastvensky's bedside and politely says, "Defeat is a common fate of a soldier. There's nothing to be ashamed of in it. The great point is whether we have performed our duty." He shakes the Admiral's hand and leaves. Rajastvensky returns to Russia and takes full responsibility for his crew and the outcome of the battle. For his failures, he is sentenced to death by the courts, but is ultimately saved and commuted by Tsar Nicholas. He lives out the rest of his days peacefully with his wife. The defeat at Tsushima was the final nail in the coffin for the Russian war efforts, and the Tsar soon sues for peace. U.S. President Teddy Roosevelt acts as a mediator for the surrender and wins himself a Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts. However, Roosevelt removed the war reparations to be paid to Japan, letting Russia off the hook. The Japanese had nearly bankrupted themselves winning the war and desperately needed the money that never came. This planted seeds of animosity towards the United States amongst the Japanese people. And these seeds would ultimately bear the fruit of another surprise attack that would take place about 40 years later. But for now, Japan had proved itself a formidable military power equal to the Europeans. And they were finally in the Cool Kids Colonizer Club. They quickly began colonizing the Pacific in a way that was even more brutal than the Europeans. Back in Russia, the humiliating loss in the Russo-Japanese War was the vodka bottle that broke the bear's back. And just 10 years later, Tsar Nicholas and the House of Romanov would be overthrown by revolutionists. A new communist government would come to power in Russia, and the world has never been the same since.